Hey everybody, this is Eli. Welcome back to Elfbait. And today I wanted to kind of take a detour from my normal D&D talk to kind of touch on one of the game systems I have played in the past that I very much have enjoyed. There are a few of those, so I'll probably be doing a couple more of these videos down the road, but it's nice to talk about some of the other stuff I've played besides D&D. So kind of go back through the way back. There was a time when I had enough time, and there was little enough stuff being produced by few enough different sources that I could actually try just about everything that was published in RPGs. The indie games, the mainstream games, I tried to get a hold of as many of them as I could. Back then, of course, if it didn't come through your game store or you didn't see it on a table at a convention, you really couldn't get a hold of it. So it was a little easier to do that. There just were fewer sources for games. So moving forward, we have the big open license explosion, which makes it impossible to follow even the stuff from the mainstream. But then we have the internet, so everybody can self-publish, and it's easier to get a hold of free rules, and everybody is putting stuff out there. And even if it's professionally made, you can definitely find it a lot easier than you used to be able to. So one of the game systems I have played, I've only had a chance to play it a few times, but I particularly find it kind of charming and interesting and with a different bent to it. So it really challenges me as a GM or as a player. Is Tales from the Wood. This is a game written by Simon Washburn, and if the name sounds familiar, that's probably because you recognize him from Barbarians of Lemuria, which is his successful, originally also free to play, free download fantasy RPG that has now gone through, I think, 2 or 3 iterations as a beautifully published and well-rendered physical item that you can play. Barbarians of Lemuria is a really great fantasy RPG that uses its own system. Simon Washburn does his own systems. He doesn't write stuff from other mechanics, although I think he has a variant RPG that's slightly D&D-ish, but that was kind of late in life for him, or later, one of his later products as far as I understand it. But Tales from the Wood. So Tales from the Wood is, at its core, a game where you're playing non-anthropomorphic animals going on adventures with a different sort of bent than the usual dungeon crawl, monster fight sort of thing. I would say the closest analog that comes to mind for Tales from the Wood in other recognizable RPGs might be something more along the lines of World of Darkness, where you are playing a creature who lives in a certain ecosystem, and most of your adventure time is really spent just trying to survive the ins and outs of that existence. You're not a superhero saving the city. You're not a fighter and his party going into the dungeon to try and get treasure. You are not investigators looking into the dark secrets of eldritch horror. You are a squirrel and a rabbit and a bird, dealing with things that come up. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. Now, to expand on that, to make it an interesting RPG, there are certain concessions that have been made to give it some texture. Conflict is essential for a good RPG, even in an RPG that doesn't really focus on combat. And Tales from the Wood also has that. And they've done that by creating a concept of this kind of morality play that's consistent with what you might see in say, stories like Watership Down, The Animals of Farthing Wood. I guess you could even go Animal Farm if you really wanted to go super weird. Although Tales from the Wood kind of paints domesticated animals, in an ill light. And I'll touch on that to begin with. So the cosmology of Tales from the Wood is a matter of the natural way of things, and the bane, the corruptive influence of man on the natural way. Now, Tales from the Wood handles this in a way that doesn't try to make any lofty environmental claims or anything. It is really just framing that as you are an animal, and certainly man has an impact on your habitat and your life. Now, going further, the game splits its animals, even the natural animals, down the middle between the bane and the way. And the assumption is that creatures that are hostile and predatory are often also associated with the Bane. Scavengers are also that way. Even though they have their place in the natural order, these animals often have a tendency to take advantage of man's bounty and therefore are considered slightly suspect or corrupt by the concepts of the game. So a fox, while he may hunt in the wood and certainly goes after, weasels and stuff like that, that fox also spends his time. Sorry, odd rattling in my garage. I think my water heater is actually trying to keep up with the fact that everybody's taking back-to-back showers and baths. Anyways, so whereas a fox is certainly a natural creature, a fox is also going to go ahead and take advantage of man's bounty and raid chicken coops and the like. Ravens, while they certainly, have their place in the natural order of things, eating carrion and the like, they will take advantage of farmers' crops, and owls will sleep in the farmer's barn, and the creatures from the wood look at these creatures with a little bit suspect. Not just because they often try to eat them, but also because they have interactions with men. Farm animals are sort of looked on as these pathetic creatures who really just don't know. The creatures from the wood just don't understand farm animals. They just, a deer and a goat are might notice, he might come nose to nose, but to the deer, he just doesn't understand why the goat isn't out doing deer things. Because, anyways, so there's the cosmology, this sort of imposed morality that is necessary for this game to have conflict, but it's not done in a heavy-handed way. It just really flavors the world. Now, animals from the wood who take on or take advantage of things of the Bane can be corrupted and gain Bane points, but they can also be undone by engaging in certain rites and stuff that are in the game to get back to the way. And so that kind of moves on to the next part of that cosmology, which is there is a subtle element of fantasy to this game. Every wood has its king of the wood, and the king of the wood is a stag, usually a stag, but I suppose it could be something else if you had a particularly different wood or whatever. But the king of the wood is generally a stag, and the stag is the law of the wood. He is sort of the mediator, the moderator. Both sides of the spectrum generally will listen to the king of the wood, and so he has the authority. Now he's not a ruler. He's just sort of the focal point, the wise one that all the other animals would really turn to. So, in addition to that, the game has one very fantastic element in it, and that is the gnome. Every wood has its gnome, and so the gnome, as written in the game, is designed as a possible PC race. Though if you are going to run Tales from the Wood, I found that it was much more useful and interesting to have the gnome relegated to NPC status. The gnome has the ability to do things that are very, very specific to the gnome. Actually, there's a section on the character sheet called Gnome Skills. Gnomes can read and write. They can learn people skills. They are not as prone to the Bane because they are fantastical creatures. So having a gnome as a PC in your group is sort of setting the game on easy. Putting the gnome out there as an NPC allows for the gnome to be unavailable. He can be a focus for an adventure where he's taken captive or something to that effect, and generally sets him outside the handy-dandy. Basically, you don't have a cleric in the party, and you don't really need one in this game if you're playing it the way it was intended. Excuse me. So, in that regard, the gnome as depicted in the game is about a 2-3 foot tall, very much kind of a D&D gnome, except for he's usually not carrying a sword or anything. He's got like a cudgel or anything, kind of a fairy folk. When I ran them as NPCs, I ran them more like the Nissa, the Scandinavian little gnome-like creatures. You might be familiar with like David the Gnome from the old cartoon series. And that, I think, is the role they intended for him in Tales from Simon Washburn, and I've talked about it in the past, way back through emails and stuff. But I chatted with him a bit. He was a very great guy back in the day. I think he... But So the role is clearly inspired by the traditional nature-keeping gnome, but I very much felt that it fell in line with the David the Gnome type of a character. So as an NPC, I ran him as this little 6-inch tall creature that could ride a fox, right? So that, and it kind of as an aside to that, the morality play between the Bane and the Way, you certainly don't have to play all of your Bane creatures as Bane creatures. You could have a fox that doesn't get involved with man and leads a natural life, and while he's still a predator, is still a creature of the Way. You could do that, and it's just as easy. It's just a matter of just removing the Bane points from that NPC fox. The other thing the game does is it does have the animals that are suitable for PC races, tend to be within a certain power range. For example, I don't believe badgers, let me check actually, I don't believe badgers are actually a PC race. They're in the game, but I believe they're actually an NPC race, but I'll double check. So, yeah, player creatures: frog, gnome, hedgehog, mole, mouse, rabbit, robin, shrew, sparrow, squirrel, toad, vole, and water vole. So the assumption there is smaller creatures who are less robust. Now, badgers are in the game, and you could certainly allow them as player characters, but they are going to be tougher than some of the other characters that you would normally, that other players might be playing. Alternately, you could also allow, say, like a raven to be played, but even though a raven is normally a creature of the Bane, perhaps there is a raven that is much more natural or something like that and avoids man. But I don't want to get too far off on a tangent on that. So that is the basic setup. You've got the Way and the Way and the Bane, and creatures that are kind of split across that. Now, what is the setting in Tales from the Wood? Well, it's the wood. And the back of the book, and this is a bound printed edition because it's only available as a free download. This really would be the entire campaign setting for most games. You've got a wood, a section of woods that is kind of in the middle of the rural areas. The game is written from a UK perspective. The author is from the UK, and so over there having little stands of wilderness in and amongst your rural communities and stuff is kind of a time-honored thing that goes all the way back to the Middle Ages, where they're actually cultivated stands of kind of semi-wild forest. So in here you've got the river that comes through the wood. You've got the deep pond and the frog marsh and the tanglebriar and the meeting stone. Now this is where the king of the forest is going to make all of his decisions. And in your individual wood, it might not be a stone. It could be a stump or a log or something. But there's going to be a central place where they meet. Now, the river goes through the frog marsh and then it continues through. You got the warrens. Now this is the warrens is a location outside of the wood but attached to the wood where the rabbits live. And so it kind of forms in context of the game. This is like taking your characters from the village, their hometown village, out to a neighboring shire or village. The meadows is also similar. It's kind of an open area. It's dangerous to go out onto because it is so open and exposed, but there are creatures that live out in the meadows that might have useful information, field mice and stuff. The rookery is to be avoided by all little animals because the crows that live there, while they're, can be useful, the crows are also, they'll eat your young, and they do associate with the farm, which is nearby. The other feature that's interesting is the Hard River. And the Hard River is what they call the road that goes by the wood, and it in all your games it's going to at least abut the wood by on one side, and that is to form sort of this it builds into the dynamic of the world, because sometimes the animals may have to cross this, or there may be things that come through there. And the Hard River is populated by the roaring owls. Again, the game is written and with the perspective of the animals, so there's this filter of this terminology that the animals are interpreting. So that is the setting. And so what kind of characters you're playing? Well, I already went down the list of characters, and it's a pretty typical 6-stat RPG system. So here's the printed character sheet, and if you see on there, we've got toughness, sturdiness, nimbleness, craftiness, fierceness, and alertness. Now, those 6 stats are really what define your animal. There are then abilities and lores Most animals are not going to have lores. Lores are knowledges, things things that you know about. Some animals might accumulate lore, but it's tricky for a regular animal to do. Lores are something, they're kind of more the gnome's abilities, and then there's the gnome skills on there. There's also a spot on here for injuries, because combat in this game is designed to allow around a very naturalistic kind of point of view, where engaging in combat is generally not to the death. Most animals, unless they're actually hunting each other, even if it's a prey and predator species, if the predator is not actually hunting the prey, and for whatever reason they get in a tangle, they're usually going to back off and not fight to the death. So you can fight hard in this game, but the result is invariably that somebody's going to come away with an injury, and some of those injuries can be permanent, and that can really hamper your character. Combat, while we're kind of that goes really quick into the the next section, which would be the mechanics of the game. So for combat, it's generally assumed that all animals are going to try to avoid combat. So combat is a very serious thing in Tales from the Wood, TFTW. If you engage in combat, it really is a single roll-off between each creature, between the two creatures involved, and the higher result wins, and the margin by which he wins determines how much injury the losing party takes. Now, this could be just a morale bust where you have to retreat. It could be a minor injury. It could be a serious injury. And so the serious injuries are where it becomes troublesome, because those things tend to not heal on their own and require outside healing, which is where the gnome comes in, or maybe you might find a friendly human. But combat is handled very simply. Just a quick roll-off. The game doesn't want to bog you down in combat. Combat with humans is invariably slanted against the animal. Humans have all the advantages. They have the guns. And in this game, if your character gets hit with a gun, you're either seriously injured or you're dead. So tangling with humans is really ill-advised and to be avoided. So what is, I guess, where Tales from the Wood, I think, is hardest to sell to people is what kind of adventures, what kind of games can you have with this system. You're not playing sword-wielding mice. You're not playing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. You're playing woodland creatures. So this is one of the areas that appeals to me most as a player and as a GM. I would love to play this game with older players, but I've only really played with my wife and my children when they were younger. It seemed like a good game to try and get them into because it was about playing animals. But I feel that there's a higher level to this game that's really only able to be appreciated by older kids or adults. If you're old enough, you probably have either been required to, or asked to, or have read Watership Down, or The Animals of Farthing Woods, The Cold Moons, which is about badgers. There's a whole bunch of these stories that were really popular. There seems to be like a period of time where they were really big. There was a lot of them that came out, but we don't really see these stories talked about too much. But in these stories, the plight of the animals is definitely not a soft, whimsical tale. There is some true danger and some epic questing that goes on within the construct of an animal's life. Watership Down was, a whole bunch of rabbits who had to uproot their society and move to another place, and all the dangers they faced. Now that would be like a major epic campaign for Tales from the Wood. Having to leave your wood and find another wood, that is a whole, that's a large campaign arc for this game. But even still, there are lesser things you can do, and a lot of times this comes down to dealing with finding a particular element of story that challenges the perception between animals and the world around them. For example, one of the scenarios that is in here is a missing child. So there's a young animal that's gone missing. You have to find it. It's a very simple one, and it's kind of the same thing as the rescue the blacksmith's daughter sort of adventure that you might get for D&D. In this case, I believe it's weasels or something that have the young animal, and it hasn't been eaten. It's escaped or something like that. But you can take it even further. Some of the adventures that I wrote were kind of plays on the animals interacting with elements of humanity and trying to wrap their head around them. I had a bit of a mystery adventure that I ran where there was a strange log trapped in the river, and so when the player animals went to investigate, they found that it was a toy boat. And so when they arrived there was a group of rats that were trying to claim the toy boat as theirs. And there was a bit of a scuffle and an argument over who got to claim it. A lot of the adventures in this game are not going to be, I go on a quest, I get the reward. It's more, in this game, it's definitely the quest is the thing. The adventure is the thing. At the end of the game, the result is going to be, probably a reunited animal with their kind or a problem dealt with. Excuse me. You might have a fire and the animals have to get to safety. It could be, if you remember the Rats of Nim, if you take out the magical weird rat place, although you certainly could include that if you wanted to, the Bane and the gnome abilities certainly allow for you to engineer something like that. But if you were to go ahead and take the whole part where the mice have to move house because the tractor is coming through, that could be an adventure. Another adventure that I wrote up was sort of a ghost story. There was a squirrel that was terrified because he had saw something stalking him in the trees, and then they later on found another animal had been strangled to death. Excuse me. It's kind of dry out here in the garage today. And so it turns out it was a plastic shopping bag from the grocery store, backlit by the moon, kind of ghostly. That adventure involved having to make a dangerous trip towards the Hard River to see if they could find clues, and involved an encounter with a group of rats again. Rats make for great antagonists in Tales from the Wood because they will be in the woods, but also they often are great to have cast as characters who have involvements with humanity. And while they may have the information that the player characters, animals, the player animals need, they're never going to usually give it up. In this case, they were eating leftovers from a styrofoam container tossed out on the side of the road, and actually were slightly inebriated because they had managed to get into some beer that had also been tossed out. So it's challenging from that aspect of coming up with an adventure that is appealing through the concept, through the perspective of an animal, but also provides a feeling of adventure. And it's not impossible to do. There are things, certainly interacting with the farm is definitely a way to go. Unfortunately, I never got a chance to play as many games of this as I would like to. I found it really appealing, but it was just hard to wrangle the kids to get it to do it. I had some adventures lined up where, the animals would have to deal with. I had one adventure that sets up the animals finding a human friend in that a veterinarian who has moved into a local cottage on the edge of the meadow. Sorry. And so, dealing with this human who is a friend to humans or friend to animals, but is a human, getting past the pictures of animal parts that he might have around on his walls, charts and stuff. I even had a long-term campaign framed out that involved finding the Great Rabbit, and it comes down to an NPC rabbit comes back just freaking out because he saw this giant rabbit going down the hard road, and he's sure that it's some sort of great rabbit spirit. So they go on this quest to find the Great Rabbit. And this actually was fun because I actually ended up drawing an expanded world map that started out at the wood and then expanded through several other woods throughout the countryside, a couple other rivers, and on the very edge of it there was the Great Forest. So there's like a ability to go in and find like deep woods characters. There was an old castle on there because it's a European countryside. There was a junkyard because I thought that might be an interesting, I mean, if animals of the wood are going to see a farm as corrupted, imagine just the stink of the bane that would be on a junkyard. But the whole idea behind that was the characters were going to have to find this Great Rabbit. Turns out that the Great Rabbit is just the advertising mascot for a local brewery that was on the side of the truck that was going down the Hard River. But in doing so and following along those adventures, they would have encountered other animals and other weird juxtapositions of animal and man and stuff. It would have been fun. I mean, I never got a chance to play it out, but I've still got the map in my notebook, and I've still got the notes for that. Some other things that you could do with this too is if you wanted to expand the mythological aspect, and I'd actually briefly discussed this with Simon back when we were in correspondence, but adding other mystical constructs to the setting, especially if you were to expand it into a wider range of terrain, a bigger wood or more woods or an expanded universe. I had kicked around the idea about putting trolls in there. You've got gnomes, why not trolls? The Nissa, that are from the Scandinavian myth, they're often juxtaposed against the trolls. And if you recall, the David the Gnome character is associated also with that wonderful book on gnomes from back in the day that also talked about their big adversaries, the trolls. And so having trolls in there adds an extra antagonist that's not always going to have to force man in there. You could interject things like fae folk, other forms of fae folk besides the gnome if you wanted to. I would advise, if you're going to do that, to go ahead and make sure that you keep them as NPCs and encounters. Otherwise, it just stops losing that feel of animals. In my adventure with the ghost, it was done as kind of a Halloween thing. After they got the initial information from the rats, I had almost a dungeon crawly sort of a thing go on. And this is again part of the fun of trying to create within this landscape. So they had to find an old tree. That old tree actually had a guardian where they ended up getting up there, and it was a big rotted, tree, and crawling out of it came this big old centipede. And so they had to fight this centipede. Probably bigger than the natural world would allow for, but if you were to put this through the goggles of like an old, Don Bluth Disney animal adventure kind of movie, it could be gross and scary, but elevated, to the point where it was not outrageous, but certainly dangerous. And centipede venom can be dangerous if you're just a mouse. But they had to go up through this stump, and there was a couple of skill challenges because it was rotting to get to this owl up there. And I took a bit of a note from Rats of Nim, where they have to deal with the owl and talk to him and get the skinny on him, and he's kind of dangerous and spooky, sort of like going into the dragon's lair and having to deal with the dragon as an NPC. But yeah, so my imagination goes crazy when it comes to coming up with ideas for this. I've always been a fan of Watership Down, Animals of Farthingwood, stuff like that. The animal stories, animal tales, Journey Home, Milo and Otis. While they're not quite in the framework of this game, they can be an inspiration for the types of adventures that you would go on. Some of those old Disney nature movies, there's that old bear again kind of thing. One last note, while the game is certainly framed for the English countryside, you could easily move it to American suburbia or rural America, or anywhere else where you live. The game, one of the cool things the game does have in it, it has a system for creating new animals. Though some animals are easily reskinnable. I mean, a small bird is a small bird, and most of them don't do much that's anything fancy or different. If you wanted to, say, pull a Peter and the Wolf, you could have, somebody, you might have a player who doesn't want to play any of these but wants to play a duck. Okay, well, you could write up a duck. Well, there are wild ducks, so you could do this, certainly do that. But you could play a domestic duck, maybe a friend from the farm, that the creatures from the wood like. But if you're going to port it to other countries, other areas, I mean, everybody's got a rural something where you're on the edge of where man meets the wild. And it could be that you're playing in New York City and your animals of the wood are the creatures that live in Central Park. You can put this anywhere, and where you put it is going to determine what animals you have. Certainly some places are going to have less weasels and more raccoons. Some places are going to have less water voles and more possums. If you're in Australia, half your animals are going to be poisonous and want to kill you. But you also got plenty of small, cute little critters. And heck, maybe that's an excuse to have a weta as a PC or something, although that's New Zealand. But anyways, you know what I mean? It's just where you put your game is going to determine your animals. And the cool thing is that Simon Washburn, when he wrote this, did include a system for creating new animals. So that is Tales from the Wood. It's got charm. It's lost on some folks who look at it and go, "Oh, why do I want to play a non-anthropomorphic animal?" But you know what? If you're looking for something different and you really want to change that perspective in gaming, try this out. You might find that it's challenging as a player to suddenly not have hands, and really, you're not playing like squeak squeak, I'm an animal. There's an assumption, like with Watership Down and Farthingwood, these animals can communicate with one another, and they certainly have a certain level of understanding that's higher than we might attribute to our real world animals. But give it a try. I'm pretty sure it's still available online. If you just were to Google, Tales from the Wood, you can find it. I'll put a link up in the description below. If it's and so certainly that'll help you out. But if you're not the folks to look at the description, Google's a thing. But yeah, give it a try. I'm gonna be doing more videos about sort of the oddball games and interesting little systems I've picked up in the past. After this one. But if you have questions and comments, what do you think? Is this a game that would appeal to you? How might you running games for animals and stuff? But yeah, down below in the comments is where to throw that information, and like, share, and subscribe. We've got Elfbait on Facebook, Elfbait on Twitter. I do have a new dedicated email address for Elfbait, and that's baittheelf@gmail.com. Unfortunately, all the elf baits were already taken, and not by me. But if you want to email me something directly, baittheelf@gmail.com, and you can get a hold of me there. Have a great one. Thanks for tuning in on this little side adventure into the wood, and get out and game.